Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll take on a topic that you, our supporters and listeners, requested us to discuss. And that is the story of Norway in World War II, from invasion to occupation, all the way to liberation. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again, another week, another podcast. We were just chatting about this. We've been doing this for nearly a year now, so quite some time actually. Not quite there yet, but we're getting there very, very rapidly. So today, Norway, as I already said, this was something that some of our listeners asked us to look at. Fascinating story. And, the usual question, where do we begin? Well, I would suggest we do what we always do, and we zoom out and we look a little bit at the bigger context before zooming in and looking at some of the military action and some of the other things. Do you think that's a good idea? And if so, do you want to start us off, or is there something else that you would like to say before we start?
Well, as our American listeners and viewers might say, that is certainly a slow, fat one right over the plate. Because of course I want us to talk about historical context. That is the name of the game. However, I do want to say one quick word in addition about the genesis of this episode, because we'd like to do this more often, and we'd like you listening to this right now out there to help us out, to give us your input. We want to talk about what you want to hear about. This topic, Norway, as Matthias mentioned, was chosen by our supporters in a poll. And if you think you want to have a say in another topic that we discuss, you can become a supporter of the podcast. For that, you can go to bothsidesofthewire.com. You can get access to exclusive content there in our war room, and you can vote from time to time on topics that we will cover on the podcast here. So keep that in mind. Now, as far as Norway goes, if we're going to talk very general, I think we need to start with a bit of geography, right? Geography is important for war. Nobody's gonna dispute that sort of basic truth. Norway in 1939, 1940 is a relatively, I don't want to offend any Norwegian listeners out there, but it's internationally speaking, it's a relatively not that super important country in many ways. It's got a relatively small population. It's been relatively poor for a long time. That's why a lot of Norwegians emigrated, especially to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But it has some very useful real estate. Norway is, for those of you who want to imagine it in your mind, it's a very thin and long country stretching along the North Sea, basically opposite the North Sea from the UK. And it also borders on Sweden to its other side to the east. This means it's important for a couple of reasons. One is because Germany imports a lot of its iron ore from Sweden, but it imports much of that iron ore through Norway because the quickest route from the mines to a port on the sea is through Norway at a port. And we're going to hear about this place a lot in today's episode, a place called Narvik. So that's kind of, Norway is a key cog in the wheel of the future German war machine because it's where the ore moves through. In addition, it has this very long coastline on the North Sea with lots of little protected areas. We've all heard about these famous, or I guess most of us have heard about these famous fjords, protected, narrow, deep inlets into the coast. Norway has tons of them. And that is very appealing if you need to fight against Great Britain, because you're going to be able to base aircraft on the Norwegian coast. You're going to be able to base warships, make them hard to find by hiding them in the fjords, or you're going to be able to base U-boats or what have you. So Norway's got this real estate going for it, and that's what's going to get it into trouble. because both the Brits and the Germans kind of look to Norway and say, well, we really don't want the other guy to have it, right? And that's kind of how things get started for Norway in World War II. Unless, Matthias, I've left out an element that you want to focus on.
No, I think it's all there. I can just re-emphasize the point. It's all about the iron ore, which means, as you already said, it's actually Sweden that is important, not so much Norway. It is Narvik because in ice-free harbor, that's the crucial part. And the Germans know that they need this iron ore. The Allies know the Germans need the iron ore. And when you look at transporting it, for example, through the Baltics, you're running into potential problems as well. It might freeze over. You might, in a later stage, perhaps go to war against the Soviet Union because that's what Hitler wanted. So shipping stuff through the Baltic Sea is a problem all in itself. So that really is the crucial bit. And that's an interesting one in itself, I find, because most of the time when we talk about military history, we talk about the sharp end, we talk about the battles, we talk about explosions, all that kind of stuff, because that is, in inverted commas, the cool, the sexy stuff everyone wants to deal with. But when you look at this and you look at this particular operation, and yes, obviously, dear listeners, we're going to unpack everything. Here you have a very, very clear economic driver, which really decides you might say, the fate of Norway in the war. Because, as you already said, it's both the Germans and the British looking at Norway and saying, ooh, this is interesting. We need to seize this. We need to control this or deny it to the enemy. So the economy is really important. It's the economy stupid, isn't it? Which really, really plays a role. And sometimes we tend to overlook these things, but we need to lift ourselves up and look at the bigger picture stuff here. And the bigger picture stuff is the economy. And as you've already said, the second part of it is the strategic advantage that Norway, this rugged coastline, gives you if you're fighting against Britain for the naval bases and also the air bases. And again, we're going to unpack that a bit more. So absolutely right. So you might say Norway is in a poor, bad situation. They haven't done anything wrong, so to speak. There's, of course, another country, which I think we're not really going to go into great detail on this episode, but that, of course, is Denmark. Denmark plays a role in this whole story as well. And Denmark just gets invaded because it's the springboard to Norway. That's all it is. I mean, there's hardly any fighting there. It takes a few hours. There are a number of very, very small actions. Few things happen, but the occupation is over basically within the morning. And that's it. And the Germans take over. And again, there's an interesting regime they established. That's perhaps a different story. Maybe we should do an episode on Denmark, because I know we're concentrating very much on Norway in this one. Just want to throw this out, that they are even, well, you might say, even more unfortunate because they are just in the way. And the Germans need the sea lanes, they need the airfields in order to get to Norway. So poor little Denmark, you might say, and also poor little Norway. They really didn't deserve to be invaded.
And poor little Belgium, and poor little Belgium. A lot of German neighbors can be described as just in the way and poor little in the 20th century, I'm afraid.
That happens, unfortunately. There's a lot of that going on, yes.
There is. So, yes, Norway's in this difficult situation. They want to remain neutral, as they did in the First World War. That's their preferred policy. Obviously, you don't want to risk joining some war, especially where you don't have your own national interests at stake. But as fate would have it, if you're Norway, it's not as simple as that. The British are very concerned about what might happen if the Germans take over Norway and get all these bases and secure their iron ore routes. So they ask the Norwegian government, which I have to say, let's give the Brits credit for that. They're asking, right? Start by asking. And they say, hey, could we land some troops? But even though in general, and I've seen some quotes from Norwegian leaders and politicians who are open about this, in general, they're more sympathetic to the Allied cause than they are to the German cause. There are some exceptions, and we will get to those in a moment, and how they changed the English language forever. In general, the Norwegians are sympathetic to the Allied cause. They're no real fans of Germany's policies, but they're very afraid of provoking Germany. And this is another theme we see in 1939 and early 1940 again and again with the Dutch and the Belgians, for example. They don't want to do anything that might provoke the Germans. In hindsight, this is not a good idea because the Germans don't need to be provoked. They are just provoked as a normal state of being from 1933 to 1945. So there's nothing you
the
can
classic
do.
German characteristic, yes, absolutely, being provoked.
Right. There's nothing you can do or not do to provoke or not provoke Germany between 33 and 39. They're just provoked. It's just how it is. So they refuse, the Norwegians, that is, refuse the British request to land troops. The British and French, though, they haven't quite given up on this idea. They're still thinking about it. And during the Winter War, when the Soviet Union invades Finland in November 1939, that war carries on until early March 1940. And the British and French are then worried about, well, how far are the Soviets going to go? Are they going to now be involved? Maybe that means we should land troops in Norway to secure this strategic piece of ground. But of course, they don't. Because Finland ends up signing a peace treaty with the Soviet Union, and then that sort of strategic threat from the British and French point of view calms down. There are still some incidents, and before I turn it back over to you, Matthias, I wanted to mention the Altmark incident before we move on. So this is another element in this phase of Norway's still neutral, but everybody wants to get in on this Norway party, and they're not, and here I include the Brits in this to some extent, they're willing to play fast and loose with the rules about neutral countries. In 1939, in late 1939, there's this famous naval battle off the coast of South America. The British Royal Navy manages to defeat a German naval grouping where the most famous ship, I guess, is the Admiral Graf Spee. It goes down, but it has a supply ship that survives all of this. The Graf Spee's supply ship is called the Altmark, and it makes off for Germany. It's trying to get back home. And it is getting home by going through Norwegian waters. And the British know that this is happening. They locate the ship, and they don't want it to get back home because it has a bunch of British prisoners of war on board that were taken in previous naval fighting before the Graf Spee went down. So the Brits basically say, our guys are on that ship, and we don't really care too much if it's in Norwegian waters. The Norwegians stop the ship, they inspect it, but they decide to let it continue on to Germany through their waters. And so the Brits basically just send warships, seize it, board it, and free the prisoners. So now you have a situation where there's been an incident, and both Britain and Germany are both looking at the poor Norway and saying, hey, you're favoring the other side. You're allowing the other side to do something that's useful to it. And this increases the attention on Norway and also the pressure on Norway.
Yes, absolutely. It really is a very complex and very confusing story, the build-up to this particular invasion. It was actually even picked up, if I jump forward now quite a bit, during the Nuremberg trials as well. And I said, so here's a very, very good example of the German war of aggression. And so we can use this, we as the Allies now, in order to put the Germans on trial. The German defense then actually said, no, you can't. Because when you look at your plans, they were just basically exactly the same. The only thing that happened was that the Germans were, they would have said, of course, more efficient, got their act together and got there quicker. In Nuremberg, it was then said, no, that's not quite true, because here's evidence that already in 1939 the Germans were planning an invasion. So you can see there's a complete tit for tat, and it's really, again, unlucky Norway. Say, let's go back a little bit and unpack. You already talked about all the key points here. So the British and the French planning this invasion, using the Finnish Winter War as the excuse to land troops, to occupy Narvik, and to go potentially into Sweden as well. That's a clear breach of international treaties, of neutrality, of everything. Didn't come to it, because as you already said, the Finnish Winter War comes to an end too early. You then have the two other things, or three other things that the Allies are doing. And you can see I'm playing devil's advocate here now, having a go at the Allies before I then have a go at the Germans. So you can see everyone deserves a go in this one. You have these two other operations that the Allies are planning, and already you alluded to them. So one is the so-called R4 plan, which is basically, again, the invasion of Norway and making sure that the Germans don't get the iron ore. Again, complete breach of neutrality, complete breach of the rules of war, all these things. So that is an act of aggression and an act of war. Should have happened. It doesn't happen. You might argue mainly, again, because the Germans are faster than the Allies when it actually comes to it. Then you've got Operation Wilfred. That was a naval operation, which is started only one day, in the end, one day before the Germans then really set sail. So again, you can see there's this tit for tat. So who starts us, who doesn't. If they'd done it earlier, they don't, but if the Allies had done that earlier, it would have meant the mining of neutral waters, so the Norwegian waters, in order to force the German ships to go out of the neutral corridor of the Norwegian water into the open sea, where these cargo ships could then be sunk by the Royal Navy. So again, a complete breach of neutrality and what have you. So these are acts of aggression that the Allies are planning. So there's no other way about it. If you then look at the Alkmaar incident again, you've got the same thing here. And it's interesting when you look at what the Norwegians are doing. So the ship goes into the Norwegian waters. It's actually boarded by a Norwegian crew. They check everything. They, strangely enough, don't hear or see these 300 prisoners, which is really quite odd because the Alkmaar isn't that big. Accidentally. You might argue, or you might say, that shipping prisoners of war through neutral waters was not against the rule of war, or the rule of law at that particular stage. The Brits do the same thing in 1939 when they bring German prisoners of war through the Panama Canal. So you might say, this is, even if they'd spotted them, this does not go against the rules of war at that particular stage. The Brits turned around afterwards and said, okay, technically that's correct. However, the Germans went out of their way in order to get into neutral waters. That's not the way it should be done. They should have taken the shortest route, which would not have taken them through Norwegian waters. So again, you can see there's a bit of a legal argument here. Anyway, cut a long story short, the Brits then get involved. They demand from the Norwegians that they are allowed to board the ship. The Norwegians say, no, you're not allowed to. This is, for us, a neutral ship because we're not at war. So you're not allowed to do this. This would be an act of aggression. And Churchill then actually sends a telegram to the British warships and says, no, do whatever you need to do, board the ship. If you do get fired on by the Norwegians, first of all, don't retaliate. If you have to fire back, only fire back in self-defense. But do make sure that you board the ship. So again, Churchill builds in aggression. You might actually say, if you wanted to create an argument out of this from the Norwegian side, that would be a casus belli. That's a reason to declare war on Britain. If your own ships are getting shot at by British warships in your waters, that's an act of war. I'm going quite big, but you can see the rationale behind this. What actually happens then is that the Brits actually board the ship. Before that happens, the Norwegian ship actually gets in between the German ship and the British ship and say, you're not allowed to pass. This is our waters. You're not allowed to get here. But the British ship is bigger, so Big Brother wins. And you already said what happens. They board the ship. There's some sort of hand fighting. 7 or 8 sources are a bit unclear. German sailors get killed. Hitler is furious, by the way, because he thinks, why they're not all dead. So that wasn't a particularly heroic action by the German Navy. You should have won this fight or go down with the ship, or at least everyone should be dead. So he's not happy at all. And that settles that particular incident, which leads in a protest note sent by the Norwegian government all the way back to London. But that in the end settles that incident. So that's on the British side. So there is an interesting action here. What happens on the German side is, of course, that does not fill the Germans with confidence that something is not going to happen should some sort of war break out, or should the Brits decide to cut the iron ore supplies. And that means that the Germans are now starting to intensify the planning for the invasion. So the Alkmaar incident is the 16th, 17th of February 1940, and basically from the 20th onwards, they really start accelerating the planning for an invasion. But, and this is the big but, so far you might say the Germans are not doing anything wrong. However, of course, they've been looking at an invasion since 1939, and that is correct. And there are sources that in December 1939, Raeder, who is the commander of the Navy, has a meeting with Hitler where he pushes very, very hard for invasion of Norway for the strategic reasons that we already talked about. It's a good naval base. Because this is 1939, we're not in 1940. France hasn't been defeated yet. You can't use the French Atlantic ports. You're basically stuck in the German Bight, just like in the First World War. You can't get out because the Royal Navy is there. If you manage to get the ports in Norway, you would be able to basically take your ships and go to the north around Britain and get into the Atlantic, and then sink ships, do whatever you want to do. So that's the strategic idea behind it. And that starts in 1939. Now, of course, there's another point here. Just because one military commander going to the head of state saying, I think this would be a good idea, does not mean that this is policy. This is military planning. Military planning does these things. You do it all the time. Even today, when you look at some military planning that's going, you think, oh my God, if this ever saw the light of day, that wouldn't be good. I mean, you can look at the Allied side, look at the British plans, basically a war game, you might say, playing through the invasion of the United States. That's just before the outbreak of World War II. At the end of World War II, the Allied war plans, but mainly the British ones, to continue the war in 1945 against the Soviet Union. So military planning does not mean that this is policy. So you have to take it one step back, you might say. However, there's another however. There are a number of meetings then between Hitler and the military leadership, and from the accounts, we do know that Hitler is toying with this idea as well. And Jodl, for example, the head of the Wehrmachtsführungsstab, in late 39, early 1940 says, well, Führer still hasn't decided on this. He's still toying with the idea. He's still looking for a political excuse to invade Norway. So again, you can see there's a build-up. There's tit for tat. There is left and right. So they're basically both planning, both going through things. And you might perhaps say, if I now want to play the good German card here, if that's the right thing to do, you might say, well, the reason why the Germans look like the villains in this particular one is because they're more efficient and because they get their act together faster than the Allies, and that's why they get there first. Now, this is quite. I could see you smiling. I put that in there deliberately to basically get a reaction. Jesse, what do you think of that? I know you're going to shoot me down for this one now.
Well, I mean, look, the British and French don't have clean hands in this story about Norway. I think that's clear. No matter what your interpretation is out there, listener, facts are facts. We can interpret them in slightly different ways, but I think that it's clear that there's realpolitik happening here on the British side. There's absolutely no question about that. One thing that I do think speaks a bit positively, if we're in the business of maybe comparing the intentions and how they're acted upon, is that the British do have a little bit of an incremental type of approach. So they're a little bit more hesitant. I don't think it's only that they're not as efficient as the Germans. I think it's also...
Let's go with the cliche. We have to go with the cliche.
Right. Of course, Germany overall in World War II, in terms of industry and so on, and politics, not efficient. But that's another story. That's
another podcast. That's an interesting topic, actually.
Indeed, it is. The incremental aspect to British policy here, I think, is kind of important because they do ask initially if they can land troops. Then the Norwegians refuse, so the British don't land troops at that point. They still have plans potentially to land troops, of course. Then they say, well, yes, we'll maybe break the rules because we want to mine your waters, but there are foreplan, if memory serves, as far as I've read, there are foreplan to land troops in Norway, depends on how the Germans react to that mining. So if the Germans don't really do much, the Brits probably are not going to invade neutral Norway. If the Germans start preparing to invade Norway, then the Brits will put R4 into action. So that's, I think, the charitable interpretation towards the British, where there are a few more hurdles that they put in front of themselves before just going and invading a neutral country, which The Germans, obviously, because their political system is a lot different, they don't have to worry about those hurdles. Somebody can just decide to invade the country, and then the country is being invaded. And that's essentially how it works out here. Maybe this is a good spot to introduce one of our Norwegian characters, because the Germans are worried, with partly good reason, of what the Brits might do. And someone in Norway is feeding them some information as well. This guy, as I'm sure listeners you might have guessed, is a man by the name of Vidkun Quisling. Norwegians out there, apologies for my pronunciation. I don't know anything about the Norwegian language, but in my brain, it sounds something like Vidkun Quisling. Quisling, I guess, in English is the more familiar pronunciation. He's the head of basically Norway's fascist movement, fascist party. And again, apologies to the Norwegians. It's called something along the lines of National Samling, which is, I guess, National Rally, Collection, Assembly, what have you. And he's very excited about the prospect of the Germans arriving. I don't want to exaggerate his importance in the country. It's not like he's running the show. It's not like the Norwegian Fascist Party, has a majority support or anything close to that. But he does try to exaggerate the danger of Norway allying itself with Britain to increase German fears. Now, the Germans don't fully trust him because he's kind of a bit of a less than honest, less than trustworthy figure. And he will make a return, of course, in our story for today. But I think that's another little ingredient in the landscape and the intel landscape as far as these German strategic fears go of British intervention.
Absolutely right. I mean, we could talk about Quisling much, much more. You already mentioned it. Maybe we leave that for later when we talk about the occupation itself. So maybe return to the military side for a moment, and let's look at, for example, the German planning. So what is it that the Germans want to do, and what is the idea behind the operation? We already talked about the bigger political and, in particular, the strategic aim of the whole occupation. So how are you going to do this? How are you going to take over such a huge country with such a long coastline that is so rugged and difficult to control? Well, the way you do this is, first of all, you need to have, and that's very obvious, you need to have a proper joint operation. And joint means you need to have the army, the air force, and the navy involved. And that immediately, of course, makes it a bit difficult for the Germans because the navy, the Kriegsmarine, is not particularly strong. Particularly, of course, when you compare it to the Royal Navy. There are historical reasons for this. Germany is a landlocked power, really, well, not landlocked, but controlled by land and surrounded by potential enemies on land, has always put in its history the army, the land forces at the center of attention. Well, you can even see it in terminology today. So, for example, the term Armee, army, is used in German for all the services. The term, sometimes even Heer, which really is the literal translation of army, is used for the German Bundeswehr, so the German forces that we even have today. The term soldier, Soldat, is a generic term, whereas in the English language, of course, soldier only means someone from the army, and you've got sailors and airmen. In German terminology, Soldat means everybody who wears a uniform. So you can already see from terminology, you can see the different aspect. There's, of course, a short exception to this rule. This is during the Empire, so the First World War. There are internal political reasons as to why the Navy is important. It's a different story, a different podcast. Again, dear listeners, if you're interested, go to our sister podcast that deals with the First World War. But apart from that, it's all about the army. And then, of course, you've got the end of the First World War, you've got the Versailles Treaty. You've got other treaties that are signed afterwards, in particular with Britain, which decide the size of the German Navy. And the German Navy is very, very small. So the German Navy, for example, at that particular time consists of just over 30 destroyers. That's not a lot. You look at these battleships, you mentioned the Graf Spee. They look impressive on paper, but in reality, they haven't got enough of them. They're not overly strong. They look good, but okay. There's a reason why the most famous part of the Navy on the German side is, during the war, is the U-boats, which are very, very small. So here's a problem. But you need to use the Navy because you need to get these guys or the army guys somehow into these ports and areas. And that also means, of course, you need air support because you can land some people by air. It also means you can use the joint approach and support the army with the air force, because that's how the Germans do war. That's this wrong terminology, the Blitzkrieg tactics, and that all of this is already a challenge. You might say the good thing, which makes it perhaps in inverted commas a bit easier, is that you don't really have to occupy all of the country. What you need to control, as always, is the capital. You really want to get your hands on the political leadership, including the king if you can. And then what you need to do is you need to occupy and seize the strongholds, the fortresses, the towns along the coastline. We already mentioned Narvik, that's up in the very, very north. And then, of course, you've got some others. You've got Trondheim, for example. That's very important. You've got Bergen, Kristiansand, Arendal. So these are these fjords. And again, my apologies for the pronunciation. That's very German pronunciation of Norwegian places. I'm not quite sure. Norwegians, please let us know whether that's the right sort of pronunciation or not. We had some comments on our Dutch pronunciation some time ago. So please let us know whether that's right or not. But these are the areas you need to seize. And this is what the Germans are trying to do. They put this plan together, and we can talk about the detail in a minute. And they do that relatively rapidly. So they're planning from December, really 1939 onwards. But after the Alkmaar incident, the whole thing gains momentum. And the story is that the German general who's chosen to become the general commanding all of this, a chap called Falkenhorst, is chosen because in the First World War he spent some time in Finland. So he said, well, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, it's all Scandinavia, it'll do. That's as good and as far as the military experience on the German side in this area goes. Of course, they're being fed information by the defense attaché and all these things, but again, the German spy network is not that good, so that's what they do. There is the story that when he is told that he will have to come up with a plan because it has to be so rapid now, that after the meeting with Hitler in Berlin, he goes to a library, takes a Baedeker travel guide out, and based on the information he finds in the travel guide on Norway, puts together this plan of the invasion. Is that really true? Well, it's a good story. Probably not that true, but it also shows you how much he knew about Norway at that particular time if he has to get a travel guide out. But then the planning really kicks off and really gains momentum, and they come up with this plan. I'm just going to throw it out very, very briefly. So you're having, after the occupation of Denmark, which we already mentioned, and we always have to include this here, which is the springboard for in particular the Air Force then to support the Germans in Norway. You have Navy convoys that are being sent out, and these Navy convoys have battleships and destroyers, but they also have troop carriers and cargo ships. And these are supposed to be sent out before the official invasion happens, and then at the same time, simultaneously, you would disembark and take over the fortresses. In order to do this, you have the first task group, which is going all the way up to Narvik, and this is mainly on the army side. This is the mountain troops, the German Gebirgsjäger, under a chap called Dietl, and again we'll talk about the action a bit more detail later on. Very, very famous action, and also very famous German general that fights there. And this battle group is quite strong by German standards because, so the naval battle group, because it comes with two battleships. And that's the Scharnhaus and the Gneisenau. And that's already, the fact I'm saying this is a big one, already tells you how weak the German Navy really is at that particular stage. You then have to Trondheim, you've got heavy cruisers, Hipper, 4 destroyers and 1,700 troops. Further down south, you got to Bergen, you've got light cruisers, again with troops about 1,900 troops. And then further down, Kristiansand, Arendal, another light cruiser, some torpedo boats. So again, you can see it's not particularly impressive what the Germans have here. It's not an awful lot. 5 motor torpedo boats, they get listed as if this was a great thing for an invasion fleet. Well, compare that to 1944, to D-Day, for example. So this really is quite poor because that's all the Germans have. And then you go further down, and then you got Oslo. That's against a heavy cruiser Blücher, which suffers a very nasty fate. Another heavy cruiser, light cruisers, minesweepers, and about 2,000 troops. So each of these contingent, roughly speaking, between 700 and 2,000 troops. That's not a lot of troops, if you think about it. With that, you want to take over practically a country. You've got more troops being sent in later. So in total, they have an entire corps, and that has 2, 4, 6 divisions. So that's more than the task force you've got here. But one of the reasons why they can't send more troops is simply because they haven't got more shipping. So that makes the whole thing very, very difficult. You have, and then I really shut up because I've been talking for quite some time, just to continue with the naval aspect, because we don't really talk a lot about the naval aspects, because we're both not very wet when it comes to history, I think. So it's not my area of expertise. But one thing that is interesting on the German side, again, is the U-boats. Because the very limited number of U-boats that they have at this stage, they send them all out there, they line them up, and say, we're going to put them there, they're going to wait for the British ships so we can intercept them. The problem is that they're having issues with their torpedoes. So they've got the electrics are not really working, the magnetic system isn't working, and some people also said the water is too salty because they've been designed for the Baltic Sea, and the water is too cold. So there are faults and failures left, right, and center, and they don't manage to sink a single ship. So they all fire their torpedoes, but they don't sink a ship. On the other hand, obviously, well, not obviously, but interestingly, you actually do have a number of ships that get sunk. And that is, for example, a German troop carrier is sunk by a Polish U-boat, which is waiting in the North Sea, even before the operation happens. So the Poles sent back that message and said, well, we just sunk a troop carrier, something's going on. They send it to Norway. The Norwegians basically sit on it for a while. And by the time the Brits get informed and it's all gone through the deciphering, what have you, it's too late. So again, you can see intelligence is a beautiful thing if you can speed things up. That's been quite a long one on the Germans. Of course, there's more we need to say, but you're just there like basically twiddling your thumbs. So I'm going to throw it back to you. More on the Germans, or do we need to look at what the Norwegians are doing and the Allies?
Rapt attention, Matthias, not twiddling my thumbs in any way, shape, or form. Rapt attention, like all of our listeners and viewers, I'm sure. Just as far as the plan goes, just a couple of other little nuggets that I thought were interesting. I mean, the plan is not only cooked up in haste by the Germans, but it's also pretty daring. I mean, you're taking very minimal forces. You're risking a huge chunk of your small navy to grab a hold of this. Yes, it's quite important, but it's also a partially secondary theater. So, I mean, you're taking a very big risk. You're doing it with minimal forces. It has to work. If it doesn't work, you're going to have a major, major problem, because then the Brits are going to be in control of Norway. You will have, egg on your face, and it might even damage Hitler's plans to continue the war in such a daring, such an aggressive fashion. So there's a lot riding on it. One of the assumptions the Germans make is that the Norwegian king, and here again, I'm going to do my best guesstimate of how one should pronounce his name. I'm going to say Hakon. That's his name as far as I can tell. So the Germans assume that once they sort of capture the capital, that Hakon and his government are going to basically surrender and do what the Germans say. This is baked into their assumptions. Things are not quite going to go that way. That's going to be a bit of a problem. Another bit of an internal wrinkle on the German side, as far as I recall from my reading, is that this plan that is ostensibly lifted from the pages of a tourist guidebook, at least in part, might be apocryphal, but would be a cool story. It comes from the High Command of the Armed Forces, right? The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. And the individual service heads of the Luftwaffe and the army and so on, there's a little bit of tension there, that you've come up with this last minute risky plan and we weren't fully involved in the development of it. So there's a little bit of those inter-service tensions that so often happen in wartime. The other little intricacy, I think, if we're going to bring back the big bad Brits as far as Norway is concerned, is that the Brits are really on the edge of launching R4. So they're in the process of beginning to gear up to launch their R4 occupation plan for Norway when the Germans pull the trigger, and the Germans are on their way first.
So in this episode, there's been quite a bit of Brit bashing going on here. And of course, we bash the Germans. That's what you always do. And poor little Norway.
With reason.
There's, of course, yeah, well, obviously, there's another nation, of course, that needs to be bashed as well. So it's a good whack all round. And that, of course, is France, because the French are involved in this planning on the Allied side as well. And when you look at the task force that gets sent, there are French forces involved. And you have a change of government in France at that particular time. I'm not going to go into detail because that would be a super tangent. I know we like tangents, but that would be a tangent too far. Not a bridge too far, but a tangent too far. And I say there's a change of government, and the new government is a bit more forward-leaning, a bit more aggressive, and wants to do a bit more against Germany. And so they see this Norwegian, shall we call it campaign or adventure, whatever you want to call it, at that particular stage, as one good means to basically, as we said, cut off the supplies for the Germans, so to put pressure on Germany. So the French are, of course, also involved. And obviously, they're pushing against an open door when you look at what goes on in Britain at that time. Again, we would have to go into British politics, but let's just use the famous name, of course, Churchill, who is an advocate, obviously, of operations like this. That probably suffices because, again, that would be a mega tangent, and we want to save that for another day. But that's all me done.
Glowworm time.
Glowworm time.
It's
That's what it
glowworm
is.
time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the most amazing, interesting, dramatic, tragic, maybe naval actions of the war takes place in April 1940. As you mentioned, Matthias, to get us back into the operational swing of things, on April 8th, you have this Polish sub that sinks this German troop transport. So you have all these German naval task forces now that are on the water. They're on their way to Norway, but the Brits and Norwegians don't yet know that right away. So the Poles send this message to the Norwegians, hey, we sank the troop ship, as you mentioned, Matthias. But the Norwegians, they're still more worried about the devil they know than the devil they don't. Which is a real dilemma in intelligence, the infamous known unknowns and unknown unknowns and so on and so forth. They are still focused on British mine laying as their most immediate problem. So they don't pay enough attention to this warning from the Poles that German troop ships are on the way. The Brits realize there's German naval activity, but at first, they also kind of misinterpret it. They think it's a big breakout into the North Sea where you might have raiders going after British convoys, as happens during World War II, right? You do have major warships that surface, in the first part of the war anyway, that break out into the North Sea and then cause havoc and sink a bunch of cargo ships and warships and so on. But there's a significant naval clash that then confirms to the Brits, okay, this is what's happening. The real German invasion of Norway is going on. What happens is you have some British ships that run into a much more powerful German force. And that German force is led by a cruiser called Admiral Hipper. And it ends up, I'm cutting the details down to the drama here. It's the age of social media. Nobody's got time for all this context that we love. We got to get to the dramatic point here. He said, she said, where's it at? So what happens is this British force runs into this German force with this big cruiser. The Brits, they have destroyers. Now, if you're used to thinking about naval actions in terms of board games or whatever, destroyer is the next smallest category of ship after cruiser. But they're not actually that close in real life. A cruiser is much bigger, much heavier, and much more heavily armed than a destroyer. So in a one-on-one fight, it is a no context. It's not close. The cruiser's going to rip the destroyer to shreds, normally. In this case, going up against Admiral Hipper is a British destroyer called Glowworm, HMS His Majesty's ship Glowworm. And there's this wild fight between them Obviously, the glowworm is not going to win this fight, probably. It does fire off a bunch of torpedoes in the chaos. Then it uses a smoke screen to try to be able to bring up some more torpedoes and fire them again. To cut a long story short, the captain of the glowworm ends up, his name is Roop, by the way. He ends up coming through the smoke screen and ramming the hipper. So he takes this fateful decision, sort of kamikaze style, I guess you could say. We can't defeat this ship. It's too big, too powerful, but we're going out on our shields and we're just going to steam right into them. And that's what they do. The glowworm smashes into the hipper, damages it, but basically destroys itself because the front part of the glowworm is broken off. There's a big hole in the hipper. It takes on 500 tons of water. It's going to need a bunch of repairs, so it's damaged, but it doesn't sink. The glowworm, on the other hand, sinks. And what is really interesting about this action is that this results in the first Victoria Cross being awarded of the Second World War. And it goes to Roop, the captain of the glowworm, for his extreme act of courage, maybe even... That's always the thing. It's a fine line between courage and recklessness, right? But anyway, he gets the first VC posthumously because as he was being pulled out of the water onto the hipper, he survived the actual sinking, the ramming and the sinking. He's in the water. But hey, the North Sea is cold. And if you're in there for a while, you're not doing well. So they're trying to pull him up onto the hipper with the other survivors, and his strength gives way. He's so exhausted, so cold. He lets go of the rope at that last moment and slips back into the sea and drowns. So his Victoria Cross is posthumously awarded. What makes it even more unique is that part of the reason he got the VC is because Captain Heye of the hipper talked about what the glowworm did and basically said this was an unbelievable act by the captain of the enemy ship. And that was one of the reasons why Roop gets this VC. There's a great thread by a very interesting social media content creator, goes by the name of John Bull. If any of you are on Blue Sky, I think that's where the thread is about the HMS Glowworm. It's quite a detailed account, super dramatic. That's an interesting one if your appetite has now been whetted for glowworm-related content.
It is a fascinating story, and what I like most about it is I was waiting for the finale here. So as you then explained, the VC and how it was done. So higher, I would say higher. I'm not quite sure. I would say higher probably. Whatever the
I
right
defer
pronunciation.
to the only German on the podcast.
So that we're not quite sure about Norwegian pronunciations. No, we're not sure about German pronunciations either. Let's go higher, whatever. So because he writes to as you already explained, because he writes to the British authorities via the Red Cross in Switzerland. I mean, that's quite something, isn't it? If you think about this. What is also interesting, again, here's a bit of a tangent, continuing the personal story of this particular man. Higher, so he then gets the Knight's Cross. He is promoted, becomes an admiral, all these things, becomes the commander of the forces in the Black Sea, and then. Which again shows you a bit the development of the German Navy. So he then becomes the admiral, you might say, of what's called the Small Naval Combat Forces. So that's these mini U-boats, that's combat divers and all these things, which is quite ironic if you think about this, because in 1940 you've got this guy commanding one of Germany's main warships, and then later on he is demoted the right word? Probably not, because he got the rank, but you know what I mean. So is this really what you want to do? Do you want to be in charge of mini U-boats when you commanded one of the big cruisers? So you can see this in itself is also an interesting sub-theme, you might call it, if you want to call it. And again, when you look at what happens to Hipper, so the ship, again, it tells you the story of the German Navy in many ways. So yes, it's, as you already explained, it is wounded, so it's damaged, so it needs repairs. It is then sent out again. It is sent into the Atlantic to sink Allied ships. cargo ships. That's all a bit of a disappointment. It works kind of, but not all that well. It then takes part in some of the operations against the Soviet Union. But in the end, Hitler is basically so disappointed with the surface fleet that he says, you know what, let's just scrap the whole thing. Let's just get rid of them and use that metal for tanks, planes, and U-boats. They managed to convince him that, no, we still need that. So it's then moored in Germany in the German naval base, where it then gets bombed by the Allies. It's scuttled towards the end, and that's basically it. So the last 2 or 3 years, it basically doesn't see any action at all, like most of these German surface ships. And there we're straight back to the Norway campaign, as we talked about strategic context. When you look at the famous story, for example, of the tear pits that is there when the Bismarck goes out. We're probably all familiar with that story. Here's another topic for a podcast. Jesse, mental note. I need to talk about the Bismarck at some point. Of course, they all go via there. They're all moored in these fjords. So this is the threat that the Germans are building up. And of course, they're using some of these ships then also to attack the convoys that go from Canada, from Britain, all the way to the Soviet Union, to Murmansk. Probably the most famous example is the Scharnhorst, which of course then is sunk as well. So it's all part of this bigger strategic piece, and also of the naval piece, which I think is very good that we talk about this. And I've been talking about the naval part quite in detail, because we don't, as I said, we don't really talk a lot of naval stuff on this podcast. We're both not experts, but I think here it's absolutely crucial when we look at the bigger strategic picture, that it's mainly for the naval part. Bit of air. But the army is just there to win the whole thing, and then the army doesn't really play a role anymore, I would argue. Which I hate to say as an army person myself, but there we are.
Right. So, listeners, we have now set the stage. The German ships are on their way to Norway, which they need because of geographic and strategic reasons in their minds, in the minds of the German leadership, secure those iron ore routes and those future air and naval bases along the North Sea coast. So we have all these flotillas on their way towards Norway. A story that we will take up in our very next episode. Just a quick reminder, this topic about Norway is one that our supporters voted for. If you also want to cast your vote for a future episode topic, you can also become a supporter of our podcast and help us do what we do. You can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. There we have exclusive content in our war room. You can get a free trial for that by using the code DEEPDARKWOODS, all one word. In any case, we will see you either in the war room or in our next episode, where we take up the story of the invasion of Norway. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Anyhow, so, now I lost my train of thought.
Now it's gone.
The tangents. Gone. I've fallen victim to my own tangent. Yes.